Hi, I'm Juan Pons. You may not know, but I do a lot of HDR work. And the reason you may not know is because I strive to make my HDR imagery as natural and as realistic as possible. That's opposed to kind of an artistic HDR look. There's nothing wrong with an artistic HDR look, but I like to create my HDR images look as natural and as realistic as possible. In the past, I have found it challenging and sometimes really trying when using programs like Photomatix or HFX Pro to create natural looking HDR images. For some time now, with the combination of Lightroom and Photoshop, we've been able to create these 32-bit files or these HDR files that enhance that dynamic range of your images, by an incredible amount. Now, this is kind of a workaround, it's a trick. It's not something that's natively built into Lightroom, meaning that you have to have a little bit of help with Photoshop or Bridge in order to do this. But it actually is really easy to do, and I have found that it produces much more natural, realistic looking HDR images a lot quicker than using Photomatix or HDRFX or any other HDR program that I've tried. So I'm going to show you here for a few minutes how I accomplish that and how you can do the same. Let's take a look. Okay, I have here in Lightroom 3 different HDR sets, and I'm not going to get into the details of creating HDR sets, but suffice it to say that you need 3, 5, 7, 9, however many number of images in which you've bracketed. You can see here on this top set of images with the West Quotahead Lighthouse here in Maine that these images are at different exposures. The ISO and the f-stop is the same on all 5 of them, on this 5 image bracket, but this first one is a 1/6 of a second, the next one's 1/25 of a second, 1/100th, 1/400th, and 1/1600th of a second. And you can see that what I'm doing here is trying to capture the entirety of the scene, because if I shot this at what my meter told me to shoot it at, I may have a nicely exposed sky like this image here in the middle, but my foreground's going to be really, really dark. Yes, I'm able, as you can notice here, I'm also shooting raw, and I'm able to go in here and adjust my exposure settings, my highlights and my shadows, to bring some of that detail out. But you can do this a lot more effectively and create a better quality image by actually merging these 3 images, or these 5 images. So what we're going to do is, in this process, is we start in Lightroom, and we're going to go into Photoshop and have Photoshop merge these 5 images into what's called a 32-bit image that we then bring back into Lightroom and work with, further on to develop it and adjust it in any way that we want. The first thing I want to do is we want to make sure, and this is usually the default with Lightroom, and this works with Lightroom 4 and Lightroom 5. Here I'm using Lightroom 5. But what you want to make sure is that Lightroom is set up in the preferences. When you go up here to your preferences and you go external editing, and the first section here is when it says edit in Adobe Photoshop CS6, that your file format is TIFF. This is very important. This is really important that you make this sure that it's TIFF. Typically, this is the setting that is set at by default. But, it doesn't hurt to go in and double check it. You can leave all the other settings as they are, leave the color space to ProPhoto or whatnot. Okay, now that we've done that, first thing we want to do is select the 5 image bracket that we're going to work with. Once I have that 5 image bracket, by holding down my Shift key, I can go into the photo menu. We go into Edit In, and we do Merge to HDR Pro in Photoshop. Now, you're wondering, why am we doing HDR Pro in Photoshop? Well, Photoshop does have its own HDR processing algorithms, but I have found that it's not all that great. However, you can use that same facility within Photoshop to actually create this 32-bit image. And what you can see is happening here on the screen is that Photoshop is actually going through and loading those 5 images that I've told it. And you can see in succession here how they're going back and forth from the brightest to the darkest image that I've shot, all 5 of them. Photoshop is going through aligning those images, even though I shot these with a tripod. And the next thing that's going to happen is that it's going to bring up for me a preview an emerge to HDR Pro preview screen. Now, what this screen is doing for me, and typically when you go into the screen, the image here is not going to look all that great. This image doesn't look bad here, but the idea here is for it to give you a preview of the range of exposures that you have. Down here on the bottom film strip, you can see that I have all 5 images, and it tells me that each of these are 2 stops difference. I can, if I needed to, I could unselect some of these or select others that I had in there. Very important, you want to go up here and make sure that your mode is set to 32-bit as well. Now you have a little histogram here with a slider, and what this slider does is it allows you, if I move this back forth, you can see this shows me the complete range of exposure that I have on this image. Okay, typically here you really don't have to do anything, except if you want to remove ghosts, and I'll show you a little later on another example how this remove ghosts button works. But in this case, I really don't have any ghosts. There's not a person in my scene, and actually there's not that much wind. So I'm just going to click OK, and Photoshop is going to go through and actually merge these 5 files into one, taking all the tonal ranges, all tonal values from the darkest image to the lightest image, and merging them all together into one single image. Now, interestingly, this process is a little slow. This machine has, 16 cores. It's a pretty fast machine, and this still takes quite a bit of time. And then what happens is Photoshop comes up and shows you this image up on the screen. And this image that you have on your screen is now a TIFF image. You can go ahead and start working on the image here in Photoshop, but I rarely do any kind of work in Photoshop myself. I do most of my work in Lightroom. So what I want to do is, typically all you want to do is hit File and Save. And you can see it shows you here that it's percentage saving, 91, it's all done saving. Now what I will do is actually close the file in Photoshop. I don't close Photoshop itself, but I close the file. And the reason I do that is because I want to give my computer a little bit of room memory-wise. While this image is up on Photoshop, it's actually using a resource as my computer, and I want Lightroom to have as much memory available to it as possible. So I'm going to close that image, and I'm going to go and move over to Lightroom. And as you can see here, I now have the image merged. You can see this is a TIFF image. It took the number from the first image in the sequence up here, and it is a TIFF as opposed to a CR2, which is a raw file. So let's take a look at this file. It looks really dark, right? Well, let's switch over to our develop module by hitting the D key on my keyboard. I'm switching over to develop. Now you can see that I have all my regular controls here. Now what I'm doing though is editing this TIFF file. Remember, this TIFF file is a 32-bit TIFF file. It has a lot more information, and I can prove that to you pretty quickly here. Look at the exposure slider. If I can move the exposure slider here, I look at that. I can go up to plus 10 stops or minus 10 stops. If you compare that to a regular image, for example, this image, I'm only able to go to 5 stops, plus or minus, because this is just a regular raw file. This TIFF image is 32 bits, therefore my exposure is able to go a lot higher, up to 10 stops, because I've captured a lot more dynamic range. Okay, so typically the first thing that I do is I'll move my highlights, and depending on the image, I may need to take my highlights down or my shadows up. So in this image, because it's dark, I'm going to start moving my shadows up. But I can see that it's not bright enough down here. So I will actually move my exposure up a little bit. Then I'll take my highlights and bring them down to actually darken that sky a little bit. I'm actually going to bring my exposure up just a tad and bring my highlights in some as well to make that sky nice and dark. Look at that. I have my exposure at almost 1 stop plus, my highlights at minus 100, and my shadows at plus 93. Now I'm going to add a little bit of clarity to this image to actually compress those mid-tone ranges. And look at that. Look at the amazing work that I'm able to do right here with just a couple simple, really simple steps in Lightroom and Photoshop, and create an image that, you know, I would not have been able to capture out in the field. You know, I'll give you an example here. I'm going to take this image, all these images, put them in my survey mode, and you can see right here, this is my bright image, you know, 2 stops down, 2 stops down, 2 stops down, 2 stops down, and here's my merged image. None of these images is able to, by itself, able to capture the dynamic range I'm able to capture in this one single image here. Okay, so that was pretty easy, pretty simple and straightforward. Let's actually take a look at another set here. We're going to take this set here of this person shooting, photographing at a waterfall. This was during my Waterfalls of West Virginia workshop. He's one of the workshop participants, and I love what he was doing here. And, you know, again, an HDR setup. You know, he was kind of in a dark area, and I have all this water in the background, pretty long exposures. So I had to make sure I told him to stand as still as possible. But what you will notice is, because there's a waterfall here, that you will have some movement down here in this area of the leaves. And this is where we're going to work a little bit with the ghost control, remove ghosts in Photoshop. So again, I'm going to select my 5 brackets, my 5 image bracket, go into Photo, edit in, select merge to HDR Pro in Photoshop, and let Lightroom talk to Photoshop and start doing its work. I am going to pause here and speed up the video so that I can show you the results on the HDR preview page. Okay, we're back here at the Merge to HDR Pro preview dialog box. And you can see again my histogram here. I'm on 32-bit, and my histogram here, I can actually move right across this range here and see my entire dynamic range. And this image was a lot more challenging than the other. Look how evenly distributed my data is across that dynamic range. Very nice. And you can see down here I have 5 different images. But these leaves down in my lower corner were moving a little bit, and because of that they create a little distraction and it looks kind of weird. So what I'm going to do is, up here on the upper right hand side, click on the remove ghosts, and you can see what that did already. It actually removed a lot of the ghosts. But in certain cases I may want to select a different image to show me the one image where my ghosts actually appear the best. So what I'm doing right now is I am clicking on my previews down here, not on the checkbox, but actually on the thumbnails themselves, and cycle through them to actually see which one works best. And I actually like this one the best because it gives me this area here nice and clear. I do have a little movement down here, but this image down here works the best. And that's as simple as it gets from the remove ghosts. Now, this is not going to remove all of the ghosts that you may run into. There's going to be some cases where ghosts are too intense, there's too many things moving, too many things going on, and this is not going to work. In that case, you need to do some advanced ghost removal using layers in Photoshop. But that's beyond the scope of this video, maybe for another time. Okay, now I'm going to click OK and let Photoshop do its work. I'm going to speed this up a little bit and come back to you when it's done processing. Okay, so here's the final file here in Photoshop. You can see this area looks horrid in that there's no details, one big blob of white. But not to worry, again, this is a 32-bit file, a file that you can actually not see with your monitor and your eyes what's going on in there. So I'm going to save this file, wait for it to save, And what's happening here is Photoshop is automatically adding this image into Lightroom. So you don't have to do anything. All you have to do is save. I close that file, switch over to Lightroom, and I find the file that I just edited, that I just created. And here it is, the TIFF file. I'm going to go into my Develop module. And again, I'm going to play around with my controls. I'm going to bring my highlights down a little bit to bring that water back in. Going to bring my shadows up to actually bring some detail on my subject. Maybe bring my exposure up just a tad. Maybe a little less. I'll use my keyboard here to fine tune this. Bring the highlights down to make sure that I don't lose detail in that water. That's very important to me, that I do not lose detail in that water. Maybe bring those shadows up a little bit more. And move. That's too much. Sometimes gotta use this keyboard in order to make better adjustments onto more detailed adjustments than I can with the sliders. We'll add a little bit of clarity again. And look at that image. What an amazing job this did. And this image does not look fake, that super saturated colors from HDR or anything like that. It looks really nice and natural. Again, I'm going to compare this image here with the other ones so you can actually see what they look like. We went from the brightest to the darkest with my resulting HDR image down here. Okay, well, that's about it. You can see I had another set here too of 3 images that I could have used as well. Let me select all 3 of them. And I could use these 3 images again to merge, where I have a nicely well exposed trunk of these redwood trees and a nicely exposed sky. Well, I hope this helped you and that you get to enjoy this feature in Photoshop and Lightroom as much as I do. As always, if you have any questions, make sure to contact me through my website, and make sure you listen to the Digital Photo Experience podcast that I run with my friend Rick Salmon. There's links to these things all on my website. Well, thanks for watching. Take care.